stoned by the town for being unwed and with child. A cowboy stepped between them and gave her father's name. The first stone hit the water barrel. I heard it before I saw it, a sharp crack, then the slosh of water over the rim, and I turned from where I'd been tying my horse at the rail outside Orrin Fitch's dry goods. There was a crowd in the street. Not a mob yet, that's what I thought then. A crowd that hadn't decided what it was. She was standing between the feed store and the farrier's wall, that narrow alley that funnels the afternoon wind, and she had her arms crossed over herself the way you do when you know there is nothing to hide behind. She was young. Not a child, but young, early 20s, I'd say, though I didn't know her name yet and wouldn't for another hour. Her dress was plain brown cotton, gone gray at the hem from the road. She was with child. Anyone could see it. There were maybe 12, 14 people. Men mostly, a couple of women back near the boardwalk, watching with their mouths set. A man I would later know as Dolph Arkin, the tanner, had a stone the size of a peach in his right hand and was turning it over slowly, the way a man does when he's working himself up. I didn't plan anything. That's the truth, and I've told it the same way since, anytime someone's asked. I didn't stand at the rail and think it through. I just didn't want to watch what was coming. I'd ridden through enough ruined country, seen enough of what people do when they get a righteous feeling in a group and no one steps in. I was 51 years old, I had a sore left knee that never stopped talking to me since a horse rolled on it outside Abilene, and I had exactly $46 and a mule named Creed to my name. I wasn't a lawman. I wasn't a preacher. I had no standing in that town. I walked across the street. The crowd didn't part so much as it noticed me, and noticing me slowed it down. I put myself between them and the girl, between the tanner and that girl, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. Just stood. My hat was pulled low because of the September sun, and I kept my hands away from my sides, open and easy, which is a thing you learn early if you mean to de-escalate men and not provoke them. Arkin said, "This don't concern you, drifter." I said, "I'm making it concern me." He looked at me. He was a big man with a red neck and a jaw like a cured ham, and he had 7 or 8 men around him who'd follow wherever he went because that's the kind of man he was, and those are the kind of men who follow such a man. "She's a whore," one of the women called from the boardwalk. I didn't look back at the woman. I kept my eyes on Arkin. "Who told you that?" I said. Nobody answered. "Who's her husband?" I said. Arkin said, "That's the point. She ain't got one. She's carrying some man's bastard and parading herself around town like it's." "She's not parading anywhere," I said. "She's standing in an alley." Behind me, I could hear her breathing. Quick and shallow and controlled, the way a person breathes when they are very frightened and trying hard not to show it. Then something happened in me that I can't explain by any clean measure. I don't know if it was the sound of her breathing or the weight of that stone in Arkin's hand, or something that went back 20 years to a thing I'd seen in a different town with a different crowd, and hadn't moved then and had carried ever since. Whatever it was, I opened my mouth, and what came out of it surprised even me. I said, "She's my daughter." Silence. I don't mean the talking stopped. I mean the whole street went quiet, the wind dropped, a horse stopped shifting, even the farrier's hammer from somewhere behind the wall went still, as if the world was deciding whether to believe me. Arkin looked at me hard, then he looked past me at her. I didn't turn, I couldn't afford to turn, but I spoke loud enough for her to hear. "She got ahead of me by a few days. I was supposed to meet her here." I let a beat go. "Her name's Calla Briggs. My name's Walt Briggs out of Palo Duro. I came to take her home." I heard a very small sound behind me. She might have gasped. She might have choked it back. I don't know. Arkin said, "I never seen you in this town." "No," I said. "You haven't because I haven't been here. Now I am." He turned the stone over once more in his hand, and then he let it drop. It hit the packed dirt with a thud that sounded final. One by one, the men around him read the air and found it changed, and the crowd unthreaded itself and drifted back to whatever it had come from, and the 2 women on the boardwalk turned and went inside, and then it was just me and the street and the girl behind me. I turned around. She was small, smaller than she'd seemed from across the street. Brown hair under a sun-faded bonnet and eyes dark gray like the sky before rain that were wet but hadn't broken yet. She was staring at me with an expression I couldn't name then. Not gratitude, not relief, not even fear. Something more careful than all of that. Like she was holding something very fragile and deciding whether to set it down. She said, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Because it seemed like the thing to do." She said, "You don't know me." I said, "No, I don't." We stood there in the alley for another moment. Then I said, "You have somewhere to go." She didn't answer right away. "Because my horse is at the rail," I said, "and I've got nothing decided about tonight. But if those men come back when there's less light, you shouldn't be here alone." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "There's a widow woman, Mrs. Calder, on the North Road. She's been letting me sleep in her barn." "All right," I said, "I'll walk you there." That's how it started. Her name was not Calla. Her name was Nora Voss. She told me that walking up the North Road, the late afternoon sun cutting sideways across the scrub and turning the dust orange. She told me in the same flat voice you use when you've decided someone has already seen the worst of your situation, and there's no sense in being cagey about the rest. Nora Voss, from Illinois originally. Father was a farmer, came west with her and her mother when Nora was 14. Mother died of a fever the second winter. Father started drinking and then started owing money to men who collected it with their hands, and then he took her west again, further west, and she followed because there was nowhere else. He'd been gone 3 months. She didn't know if he was dead or had simply decided she wasn't worth the trouble of coming back for. She told it without self-pity, which was the thing about her I noticed first. Not the belly, not the gray eyes, not even the quiet control of her voice. It was the absence of performance. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't dressing the story up to make me sorry for her. She was just telling me what had happened in the order it had happened, the same way you might describe a road you'd traveled. The man was a rancher's son named Clem Whitaker. Rich family, from what she said, with a big house east of town and a father who sat on the town council. He'd told her certain things. She'd believed him. He'd denied knowing her the moment she came to him with news of the child, and his father had backed him up. And when she'd gone to the sheriff, who owed the Whitaker family 3 years of favors, she'd been told to move along. That was a month ago. She'd been in Garnet Creek, which was the town ever since, working whatever she could find, sleeping in Mrs. Calder's barn, and slowly becoming the kind of story a town tells itself to feel righteous. I listened without saying much. Mrs. Calder's place was a small frame house with a porch lean-to and a barn behind it, and the widow herself was on the porch when we came up the road. A thin woman of maybe 65, with wire glasses, and a face that had gone from pretty to weathered the way stone does, not less itself but more. She looked at Nora, then at me, and then she said, "Who are you?" I told her my name, the real one, Walt Briggs. She said, "You the one who stood between her and Arkin." I said I was. She said, "Come inside, I'll find some supper." I ate with them at Mrs. Calder's table, ham and cold corn bread, and a jar of pickled green tomatoes that Mrs. Calder set down without ceremony. And at some point during supper, Nora Voss looked at me and said, "You should know that what you said today is going to cause you trouble." I said, "What did I say today?" She gave me a look. "You told them I'm your daughter." I did. "And that my name is Calla Briggs." I did. "You know what that means." I cut a piece of ham. "It means Arkin and his friends think I'm your father. Which means if they move on you again, they've got to move on me first." "It also means," she said, "that when people see I'm not Calla Briggs, you'll be a man who lied to a crowd of armed men." "I've been called worse than a liar." "And if you ride out," she said, "I'm Nora Voss again." I put my fork down. "I'm not planning to ride out," I said. Mrs. Calder was watching me from across the table with her hands folded around her coffee cup. She didn't say anything, but she was watching. "You don't owe me anything," Nora said. "No," I said, "I don't." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you staying?" I thought about that. Thought about all the true answers, that I had no particular place I was going, that $46 would run out eventually, and the Garnet Creek Valley looked like cattle country and I might find work, that I was 51 years old and had spent the better part of 30 years riding through other people's lives and leaving no mark on any of them, and that I had stood between her and that stone not because I was brave but because I couldn't do otherwise, and that now. Sitting at this table with the lamp throwing a warm circle of light on 3 people and a jar of pickled tomatoes, I felt something I couldn't quite name but recognized distantly as mattering. I said, "Because I told a street full of people that you're my daughter." "And a man doesn't do that and then ride out." The next 2 weeks were a kind of negotiation. Not between me and Nora, between me and the town. Because Arkin didn't forget, and the Whittaker family, the old man, Calvin Whittaker, and his son Clem, had plenty of interest in the story not changing. A drifter rides in and claims the unwed girl is his daughter. That's inconvenient. If it sticks, it means she has someone. If she has someone, she's harder to push around. And if she's harder to push around, Clem Whittaker's denial of the child gets scrutinized. I found work at the Poole Ranch, 3 miles east. Ted Poole was a fair man with 20 head of cattle and a fence line that hadn't been mended since spring, and he needed hands. I wasn't young and my knee made certain things slow, but I knew cattle and I worked without complaint, and Ted Poole was the kind of man who appreciated that. I rode into Garnet Creek most evenings after work. I'd stop at Mrs. Calder's, see that Nora was settled, eat whatever was going, and ride back out. I didn't make a project of it. I didn't make speeches about it. I just kept showing up, which is most of what you can do in a situation like that. The town talked. Of course it talked. A town that size, maybe 200 people if you counted the outlying homesteads, doesn't have much else to do with itself. The story was strange enough to travel. A drifter nobody knew had walked into Arkin's crowd and claimed a pregnant girl was his daughter. Some people found it admirable. Some found it suspicious. Some found it hilarious. And some, primarily the Whittaker faction, which was a substantial fraction of the town's respectable class, found it threatening. Calvin Whittaker came to the Poole Ranch on a Thursday. He was a trim, gray-haired man in a good coat, and he had a way of sitting a horse that told you he'd had money long enough that the money had gotten into his posture. He sat at the fence and waited for me to come to him, which I did, because I wasn't going to make him climb down if he didn't want to. He said, "I'm told your name is Briggs." I said that was right. He said, "And that you've been making some claims around town." I said, "I made one claim once to a specific group of men who were about to stone a woman." He said, "She's not your daughter." I looked at him, "You sure about that?" He said, "I'm sure because if she were your daughter, you'd have known where she was. You'd have been looking for her. Nobody in this town has ever seen you before." I said, "I've been traveling. People do." He said, "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Briggs. There is a matter of some delicacy here involving my son. The girl has made certain claims against him that are not substantiated. If you continue to involve yourself, you're going to make an enemy of this family, and this family has considerable reach in this county." I looked at the ground for a moment, then I looked back at him. I said, "Your son got that girl with child and then told her she was nothing to him. I don't know what you told him to say, and I don't know what kind of man you've raised, but I'll tell you what I know. That woman is alone and carrying a baby in a barn, and your family's money and connections are why that is. And if you think riding up to me at a fence line and using the word delicacy is going to change how I conduct myself, you've badly misjudged what kind of man you're talking to." He sat there. I said, "You want to make an enemy of me. I expect that's your prerogative. But I'd think it through." He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and I went back to the fence. Ted Poole had watched from the barn door. When Whittaker was gone, he walked over and said, "That was Calvin Whittaker." I said, "I know." He said, "You just told Calvin Whittaker to think twice." I said, "I did." He shook his head, not in a bad way. More the way a man shakes his head when something unexpected has landed in his yard, and he hasn't decided yet whether it's good or bad. The baby came on an October night when the first frost had already touched the grass. I was asleep in the bunkhouse at Poole's when Ted woke me. Mrs. Calder had sent a rider, one of her neighbor's boys, and Ted had come to get me. I don't know why Mrs. Calder sent for me. I hadn't asked her to. I hadn't made any arrangements or requests. She just sent and I came, and that's the kind of woman Martha Calder was. I rode the 3 miles in the dark and the cold, and I tied Creed at the post, and I went to the door, and Martha met me there and said, "She's doing all right. Dr. Fenn is with her." I said, "Good." She said, "Come wait on the porch." I sat on the porch steps in the cold, and I smoked a cigarette, and I listened to the sounds from inside, the low murmur of Doc Fenn's voice. Now and then something sharper, the creak of the floorboards. The frost was heavy on the grass, and the stars were the kind you only get in October, hard and bright and not decorative but serious. I thought about what I'd done and hadn't done. I thought about my own life, 30 years of nothing much sitting on me like a coat that didn't fit. I thought about my mother, which I hadn't done in a long time, and about a woman I'd known in Santa Fe a long time ago who'd wanted something from me that I hadn't known how to give. I thought about the fact that I'd ridden through towns all my life and never left a single mark, never built a single thing, never stayed long enough for my absence to register when I went. Then the baby cried. Not a question, not a complaint, just a statement of presence. I put out the cigarette on the step. After a while the door opened and Doc Fenn came out. He was a small, tired-looking man with a graying beard who smelled of whiskey and carbolic, and had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough of birth and death that he'd stopped being surprised by either. He said, "The girl's fine, the baby's fine, boy." I said, "All right." He looked at me for a moment in the dark. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, picked up his bag, and walked to his horse. Martha came to the door and said, "You can come in." Nora was propped against the headboard of Martha's narrow spare bed, and the baby was against her chest, wrapped in flannel. Her hair was loose and damp, and she looked exhausted the way people look when they've been through something that required everything they had. But her eyes were open and clear, and when I came through the door she looked up at me. I took off my hat. I stood near the door for a moment, not knowing exactly what to do with myself. She said, "Come closer, you don't have to stand in the doorway." I came closer. The baby was very small, red-faced the way they are, sleeping already. One tiny fist was curled against Nora's collarbone. She said, "I'm going to name him James." I said, "That's a good name." She said, "James Walt Briggs." I didn't say anything. She looked at me. "You gave him a name," she said. "That day in the alley, you gave him a name before he was even born. I'm not going to take it back." I looked at the baby, James Walt Briggs. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything, and after a moment I just sat down in the chair beside the bed, and we stayed like that for a while. The three of us in the lamplit room with the frost outside and the night quiet, and it was the least alone I'd felt in 30 years. I'll tell you when it shifted for me with Nora. Not in the big way, not the lightning bolt way that people like to tell it. It was a small thing, as the real ones usually are. It was maybe 3 weeks after James was born. She'd moved out of the barn, Martha had given her the spare room, which was Martha being Martha, and I'd come by after work, same as most evenings. I was sitting at the kitchen table, and she brought James out and set him in my arms because she needed both hands to do something at the stove, and she just handed him to me, easy and natural, the way you hand something to someone you trust with it. And I sat there with that baby in my arms, and he looked up at me with those dark, vague, brand-new eyes, and I thought, this is a life. This small thing is a whole life that's going to go somewhere I can't see yet, and it has my name on it, and it exists partly because I walked across a street on a particular afternoon, and that is more than I have ever done that has mattered. Nora came back and she looked at the two of us, and something moved across her face, not sentimental, not soft exactly, just sure. The way a woman looks when she has decided something and is at peace with the decision. She said, "You're good with him." I said, "I haven't held many babies." She said, "Doesn't seem like it." She went back to the stove, and I sat there with James and listened to the sounds of the kitchen and the cold wind at the window. And I thought about how strange it was to be 51 years old and sitting in a warm kitchen with a baby and be in the process of becoming someone. The trouble with the Whittakers came to its head in November. Calvin Whittaker had not forgotten our conversation at the fence. He'd waited and watched, and what he'd watched was a drifter with no standing becoming a fixture, coming to Mrs. Calder's every evening, working for Ted Poole, becoming known in the town as the man who'd stood between Nora Voss and Arkin's crowd and hadn't moved. He'd watched the town's opinion shift, not all of it, not the hardcore, but enough. The schoolteacher, a woman named Greta Lund, had visited Nora and brought things for the baby. The minister's wife had come, which was its own kind of statement. People in a town calibrate off each other, and when enough people decide that a man has behaved decently, they adjust. That was what Whittaker couldn't stand, not me particularly, the adjusting. He sent Clem. Clem Whittaker was 24, broad through the shoulders, and had the particular softness of a young man who had always had money enough that hardship was something that happened to other people. He came to the Poole ranch on a Wednesday with 2 of his friends from the Whittaker payroll, men named Burke and Elias, and they found me at the water trough. Clem said, "My father says you need to move on. I said, your father says a lot of things. He said, he means it. You've been causing problems. I looked at him for a moment. He was trying to do the thing his father did at the fence line, the look, the tone, the weight of money in the voice. But he was too young and too soft, and he didn't quite have it yet. I said, the problem in this situation, Clem, is your child. That's the problem, not me. He said, that's not my child. Your name will end up on it either way, I said. Small towns have long memories. Burke and Elias shifted. They were watching Clem for the signal, and Clem was watching me, and for a moment it could have gone 2 or 3 different ways. Then I said, you've got a son. Something crossed Clem Whitaker's face. I said, he's 3 weeks old and he looks like you around the eyes. I haven't said that to anyone in town. I haven't said it to your father. I'm telling you because you ought to know it. Silence. I said, go home. Think about what kind of man you want to be. You've still got time to be a different kind than you've been. He sat on his horse for another moment, and then he turned and rode out, and Burke and Elias went with him. Ted Poole had seen it from the barn again. He walked over and said, you know that may not be the end of it. I said, I know. He said, you do this kind of thing often. I said, I'm new to it. He looked at me in that way he had, measuring, unhurried. He said, you planning to stay in Garnet Creek? I said, I'm thinking on it. He said, if you are, I could use a foreman. I stood there. He said, I'm getting too old to manage the whole operation. I need someone who can run the hands, deal with buyers, keep the fence and the water and the herd in order. Pay's not grand, but there's a cabin on the property. Small one, needs work. I said I'd have to talk to someone first. He said, I figured. I told Nora that night. We were on Martha's porch after supper, which had become the habit, Martha inside with the baby, us on the porch in the cold with our coats on, sometimes talking, sometimes not. She'd gotten her color back since James was born, and the thing in her face that had been careful and braced had eased some. She wasn't unguarded, she'd been through too much for that, but she was easier. More herself, I thought, though I was still learning what herself was. I told her about Poole's offer. She listened without saying anything. I said, the cabin needs work. I'd have to fix it before it was livable. She said, fix it for whom? I said, well, that depends. She looked at me. I was 51 years old, and I hadn't done this in a long time, and I didn't think I was doing it gracefully. I said, I know this is a strange situation. I know I walked into it from nowhere, and I know you don't owe me anything, and I know there are things about this that don't follow the regular order. But She said, Walt. I stopped. She said, I know what you're trying to say. I said, do you? She said, yes. She looked out at the dark road. Then she said, I'll tell you something. The day in the alley I was not afraid of the stones. I mean I was, but that's not the worst of it. The worst of it was that I understood why they were doing it. I'd been told enough times that I was nothing, that I was less than nothing, that I had almost started to believe it. And then this man I'd never seen walked across the street and put himself between me and it. Not because he knew me, not because he owed me anything, because he couldn't watch it and not act. She paused. I watched your face when you turned around. You weren't showing off. You weren't performing. You were just there. That's a rare thing, Walt, in a man. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, I want to ask you something. I said, go ahead. She said, do you want this? Not the duty of it, not the thing you started and feel like you have to finish. Do you actually want it? Me and James and the life it would be. I thought about all the ways to answer that. All the careful, qualified ways. And then I thought about sitting in Martha's kitchen with James in my arms, and about riding to the Poole ranch every morning with something to ride toward, and about this porch and this woman beside me, and the way the evenings felt now compared to how all the evenings before them had felt. I said, there hasn't been a day I didn't want to come here. She turned and looked at me. Her eyes in the lamplight from the window were very steady. She said, then fix the cabin. I fixed it through December. It was a cold month with hard frosts and 2 early snowfalls that left the ground white and brittle. And I worked on the cabin in the evenings after my ranch work, new chinking in the walls, a proper door that hung square, a new pane in the side window, the roof patched, the floor scrubbed. Ted Poole let me use tools and lumber at cost against my wages. I built a small cradle from cedar and a table from pine, and a rocking chair that took me 3 weeks because I'd never built a chair before, and I made 4 mistakes before I got one that didn't wobble. Nora came out to see it on a Saturday in late December. She brought James, bundled so that only his face showed, and Martha drove her in Martha's old wagon because the road was frozen and I didn't want them walking. She walked through the cabin slowly with James against her shoulder. She looked at the cradle, she looked at the table, she touched the rocking chair. She sat down in it. She rocked it once, twice. She said, "You made this." I said, "I made 5 of them. That's the one that worked." She laughed. It was a short sound, but it was real, and it was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it landed somewhere in me like the first warm day after a long cold. She rocked the chair again. James had gone to sleep against her shoulder, his small face tucked in against her neck. She said, "It's a good chair, Walt." I said, "I know it's small." She said, "It's enough." She looked up at me from the chair. The light came in through the new window pane, thin winter light, and it fell across her face and James's sleeping face and the cedar of the cradle behind her. She was looking at me with those gray eyes, and there was nothing complicated in them. No wariness, no calculation, no performance. Just a woman looking at a man she had decided on. She reached out and took my hand. She held it for a moment, his small fingers wrapped around mine, her eyes still on me. I stood in my own doorway in December light, with a baby asleep on the shoulder of a woman who was looking at me like I was worth looking at, and something that had been clenched in me for 30 years. I don't know what to call it. A bracing against nothing, a lifelong flinch, let go. We were married in January. Not a big occasion. Martha was there, and Ted Poole and his wife, and Greta Lund the schoolteacher, and Doc Fenn because I liked him, and the minister, a quiet man named Aldous who didn't ask too many questions about the order of events. Nora wore a dress that Martha had made gray-blue, and she carried James, who was awake and solemn and looked at the ceremony with the grave expression of a very small person who has found himself in an important situation and is trying to keep up. When Aldous got to the part where I gave her my name, for real this time, not as a lie across the street, she looked at me. I put the ring on her finger. Her hand was cold and steady. She said, "I do." The way she said it, not light, not performative, just settled. The way you say something you've already decided. What happened with the Whitakers, I'll finish that thread. Clem Whitaker did not come back to the Poole Ranch. Whether it was what I said or whether he'd already decided something on his own, I can't tell you, but in February he came to the cabin. Alone, on foot, having left his horse at the road. He knocked on the door. Nora opened it. They stood there looking at each other. I came up behind her. Clem said, "I came to see the boy." Nora was quiet for a moment, then she stepped back and let him in. He sat at the pine table, and I brought coffee, and we sat across from each other, and I put James in his arms and let him hold his son for the first time. He sat very still, looking at the baby, and his face did the thing that faces do when they encounter something they weren't prepared for. Something cracked in it. Not all the way, just enough to see through. He didn't say much. He stayed about 20 minutes. When he got up to leave, he looked at me and said, and then he stopped. I said, "You don't owe me anything." He said, "I owe her." I said, "That's right." He came back 3 more times over the spring, always alone, always brief. He never asked for anything. He never made trouble. I don't know if he told his father or not. Calvin Whitaker's campaign against us had quieted. Maybe because Clem had said something. Maybe because the town's opinion had finished shifting, and there was no political advantage left in pressing the matter. By spring, Garnet Creek had mostly decided what we were. Walt and Nora Briggs, the Poole foreman and his wife, the one with the baby. It wasn't unanimous. Dolph Arkin still crossed the street when he saw me coming, but it was enough. Enough to live in. There's a thing that happens in the late spring in that part of the country. The grass comes up green after the last hard freeze, and the color of it, after all that brown and white, almost startles you. You'll be riding out to check the fence line, and you'll look up, and the valley will be that particular early green, too bright almost, and the sky will be the kind of blue that doesn't have any gray in it. And for a moment, the country looks the way it would look if everything that had happened in it had been worth the trouble. I was on that fence line in May when I saw Nora come out of the cabin with James on her hip. She'd seen me from the window, I expect, or heard the horse, and she came out just to stand there in the door. She lifted a hand. James waved his arm in that uncontrolled way babies do, the whole arm going, which he apparently thought was very funny because he laughed. I lifted a hand back. She stood in the doorway in the spring light with our son on her hip, and she watched me. And the way she watched, easy and sure, the way you watch something that is yours and that you know will still be there when you look again, stayed with me the whole ride back. I'd told a lie in an alley in September. I'd told it to a crowd of men with stones in their hands, about a woman I'd never met, because I couldn't stand to watch what was coming and couldn't find any better answer in the moment than to make myself part of her story. Turned out to be the truest thing I ever said. She's my daughter, I told them that. She gave me her hand in January and stood in a dress the color of winter sky, and said I do in that settled, decided voice. And James Walt Briggs waved his arm at me from his mother's hip on a green May morning, laughing at his own coordination. That's the story. That's all of it.